Good morning, Area 51 teens. I'm glad to have you guys join us virtually again. This is going to be the last series of our big questions discussions. And hopefully soon we'll be able to meet back in person. If not, we will go ahead and jump into Hebrews in this format for the benefit of all of you guys. And for those who don't know or haven't been watching these, remember to watch any of the backlogs of these on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. And be sure to comment or, share them along on social media. I'd love it if you could comment, maybe even on whether you prefer me standing or sitting like this. So changing up the format a little bit, being a little bit more like some TV show hosts, some late night hosts. Anyway, so the question that we're going to be going through this week and next week relates to doubts in our series called Dealing with Doubt, hence on the screen there. And as always, we're looking at kind of one big question each week. And for this week, we want to ask, what do you do when you're struggling to believe? What do you do when you're struggling to believe? And you can pause it right here and you can talk about that question with your friend if you guys would like. My thoughts on this are, so the first thing that you want to do when you're struggling to believe is you search honestly and humbly. One way that we can do this is, there's a lot of great resources out there to help when we're going through intellectual doubts. And this is mainly targeted towards doubt on whether it's true rather than doubt about whether or not we're saved. Mr. Ethan did a study on that one another time. So Tim Keller has a really great book called Reason for God that I want to encourage you guys to really read on some big issues about God's existence, to answer some questions of doubt that we might often have. Likewise, actually, there's some really good books by R.C. Sproul, who is a great theologian that died and went to be with his Lord recently. He's written a variety of books to answer some of the questions that we have in our doubt. Questions about God's existence, questions about creation, questions even about abortion, for example. He's written some really great books on that. Chances are, if you have a doubt, R.C. Sproul has a good book, short book on that topic. I also want to say, when we search honestly and humbly, we should encounter some great arguments for the faith. And, our response to our doubts shouldn't just be, believe despite the evidence. The biblical idea of faith is always trust rooted in knowledge, trust rooted in the reality that we know. So there's always a step of faith, but that faith is not by any stretch blind as the world might see it. And some of the arguments that can really help us and comfort us in our doubts, that apologetic arguments, which basically means defending the faith arguments that we can look to in our doubts, are a variety of arguments. And I'll cite some of the great apologetic arguments. First, there's the argument from the resurrection, which I think is the most powerful argument, not just in evangelism, but in comforting us when we have doubts. So the argument for the resurrection basically says that Jesus resurrected, of course, but it's more complicated than that. There's more to that. You see, a lot of people claim that Jesus didn't actually die and rise from the dead. That's the most important thing. If Jesus really rose from the dead, obviously we must believe whatever he says. There's no reason to doubt if Jesus, in fact, by his own power, rose from the dead. But there's actually a lot of really good reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, some super solid ones. And the biggest reason why we can be confident that Jesus rose from the dead was the fact that the early church rose, and so many people that claimed to have seen Jesus rise from the dead started following Jesus in the first century. Now, of course, people have followed false religions. People have followed cults with cult leaders that have made significant lies. However, in those cases, that one of two things is generally happening when somebody follows a lie. One, they're following a lie that they know is a lie because it brings them great benefits in this life. I mean, somebody might follow a lie that and even be part of a cult because it gets them rich. It gets them, that the ability to do things that they want to do. Obviously not the case for first century Christians. First century Christians knew following Jesus might get them killed. It certainly would make their life very hard. Another reason why that people do this, that is because they don't know. That they don't know whether it's true or not. They are misled. But these people actually, in the early church that claimed to have seen Jesus rise from the dead, that wouldn't apply to them because they literally made the claim that they saw Jesus rise from the dead. Literally thousands of people in the first century claimed to have seen Jesus rise from the dead. And so that's so much true that the apostles they based their faith fundamentally on their witness of Jesus rising from the dead. If it wasn't for people having seen this, the apostles would have been like, I'm not interested in this at all. So then the other response people might have is, well, some people are crazy, of course. Some people just don't make logical decisions. It's really hard to believe that 3,000 people would independently be crazy in the same way. But it's most likely to think then, when a large group of people started following a faith that many people claim to witness, that would have every reason to know why not to, when at the same time that faith cost them their whole lives, I would tend to believe that. In fact, typically with how we handle court cases, when you have that kind of evidence, it's going to be pretty easy to convict or release somebody based upon that degree of eyewitness evidence, that unbiased eyewitness evidence. In fact, not only is the eyewitness evidence unbiased, that people would have had a vested interest in not denying that Jesus rose from the dead if they saw them as well. So that's, I think, a really powerful argument, because you can't make sense of the rise of the early church and how many people that followed Jesus if Jesus had not truly appeared to that many thousands of people after he rose from the dead. Another one that can be really helpful is called the Kalam cosmological argument. So in general, there's an argument for the existence of God called the cosmological argument. And that argument basically says, well, everything has to have a first cause, and God is the first cause of the universe. The Kalam version of it is a little bit more of a fine-tuned version of it. Actually, it comes from Islam, although we can borrow some of the things in their faith. And the Kalam cosmological argument, so it kind of extrapolates upon the cosmological argument. Everybody says, obviously, there was one thing that started it all. No atheists even really believe that everything's cyclical. Nobody really believes that things kind of keep on creating and recreating themselves again. Generally, the view that atheists will have about how this world came into existence is that something like gravity, a force, was eternal, and that force brought things into existence. By chance, just by chance, all of a sudden it happened when it wasn't going to happen. But this Kalam version of the cosmological argument, it goes back to it, and it looks at also Newton's the second law of thermodynamics, which basically, the second law of thermodynamics, which relates to entropy, would imply that essentially motion keeps going. Activity that started keeps going. This idea would say that matter, anything that is without a will, if it can do something, it will do something. So gravity could have created the world in, say, 10 billion years ago. Gravity would have made the world 100 billion years ago, because it would be in that process. There's no such thing as something going from cold to hot like that out of nothing in the universe. That doesn't make sense of the second law of thermodynamics. Further, even the idea that somebody would say that it would be by chance that gravity could create the universe is a little silly, because if you think about it, when people talk about chance, actually chance is really just a way for us to express our lack of understanding of the universe around us. So we might say that when we flip a coin, it is a 50-50 chance of landing heads or tails. That's actually not true. If you flip a coin exactly the same way, that under the exact same conditions, like if you use a machine to do that, it will always have the exact same results. It won't be by chance. Instead, only chance says that, I can't replicate that exactly. I'm not a machine. Gravity's not a machine. And gravity works the same way. Everything that is created, everything that is without a will, it just happens. It's just a matter of the circumstances around it. But if something is a will, something with a will can consciously wait until a moment of time to create the world. And so if the world has a beginning, it has to have been willed into existence by an eternal first cause. And the eternal first cause, my necessity, is God, because God needs not a cause. The nature of God needs not have been created. Next, I'll address the moral argument. So the moral argument is the idea that basically the basis of our morality must assume that God exists. Everybody has some morals, whether they're an atheist, agnostic, Mormon, a Buddhist, or whatever. But it's really hard for us to really justify our belief that something is morally right or wrong, objectively morally right or wrong, if there is not a God who created us, who sets that standard. So an example people might see of this is you compare the ethics of today to the ethics of the Bolsheviks revolution, or of even the Nazis in the concentration camp. That people have often said that ethics are something that kind of is bred into us, that we are evolved into having a kind of morality of understanding right and wrong. But this morality actually is often changed based on cultures. And if anything, that idea tied to evolution, that the survival of the fittest moves society forward, denies these basic attributes of morality. Nonetheless, despite the fact that it's actually against humanity's best interest to have a law against murder in all cases, it's against humanity's best interest to block the powerful from stealing from the weak. We have passed these laws. We have universally agreed to these moral standards. And if we accept these moral standards, we have to believe that there is a personal God that has created these moral standards. That is the fundamental basis for them. And the next two arguments I'm just going to briefly refer to are the teleological and ontological arguments. So the teleological argument basically says that God is the fine-tuner of this world. You'll hear this a lot. I don't want to go too in depth, but sometimes people refer to this as the argument for irreducible complexity. And God is like the watchmaker that fine-tunes this world. And this world is incredibly fine-tuned. In fact, actually, if you look at our DNA is so complex, it's nothing like anything anyone else has created. And so people use that to argue that God must exist as the fine-tuner of this world. And then, very briefly, the ontological argument. The ontological argument essentially argues that if God can be conceived of, if God can be thought of, God by necessity must exist. This sounds like a silly argument, but it's actually a really strong argument if you really get into it in a way that would not be adequate for a short Sunday school video. But I want to say, when we search honestly and humbly, some of the worst ways to handle this is some of the bad arguments that people might encounter. So, sometimes people might get through these kinds of things and might comfort themselves in their doubts by pointing themselves to things like Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is an argument that was given to me when I had doubts as a young Christian. Pascal's wager essentially suggests we should have faith in God because, if it's true, if God exists, we benefit immensely. But if we have faith in God and it turns out God didn't exist, what's it going to cost us? Essentially, it's a bet where the upside is outstanding, but the downside is really almost non-existent. I think that's an absurd argument, because if you play that out to any faith, really ever, you would almost have to accept every single religion in the entire world to possibly be confident in yourself to pass Pascal's wager. And further, even the Apostle Paul, as we'll get to on our verse for next week, he suggested that those who If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, he's not going to follow Pascal's wager. He's going to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So these are some of the ways that we can search honestly and humbly. And next week, we're going to go more in depth about what we do when we struggle to believe. Thanks, guys. Again, I want to encourage you guys to share this and like and comment.